The after-hours security log flagged something at 1:23 in the morning that made Diane Prescott's stomach drop. A night security guard, the quiet one who barely made eye contact with anyone above the lobby floor, had swiped his badge into the restricted biomedical research wing on sub-level 2. The footage showed him sitting at a senior researcher's workstation, pulling at molecular modeling software that required a level 4 clearance he absolutely did not possess. His fingers moved across the interface with a certainty that didn't belong to a man who checked IDs and walked hallways for $11 an hour. Then he inserted a personal drive into the port and began copying files. Diane had spent 19 years in the pharmaceutical industry learning to read situations before they read her. Everything about this footage screamed a single word: theft. But what she uncovered when she followed this man beyond the Meridian Pharmaceuticals parking lot would dismantle every assumption she had carried about him, about the company she ran, and about the version of herself she thought she'd outgrown. Diane Prescott had clawed her way to the CEO chair at Meridian by the age of 41, which made her the youngest chief executive in the company's 30-year history, and, not coincidentally, the first woman. She hadn't gotten there through charm or connections. She'd gotten there by being the person in the room who noticed the thing nobody else noticed, and then being willing to act on it when everyone else was still debating. That particular skill was why she was still in her office at 1 in the morning, 3 days before the FDA submission deadline for Callistra, a gene therapy platform Meridian had spent 4 years and nearly $90 million developing. Callistra was either going to redefine the company or bury it. There was no middle ground. She scrolled through the security feeds the way she did every night during crunch periods, looking for anomalies, loose threads, anything that might unravel before she could catch it. Empty labs, dim corridors, the cleaning crew finishing up on the 4th floor, and then, sub-level 2, the security guard. She pulled up his file. Nathan Briggs, 44 years old, hired 14 months ago through a staffing agency. Clean background check, unremarkable references, previous work in warehouse logistics and building maintenance. An address in the Greystone neighborhood on the city's south side, the kind of neighborhood that corporate employees drove past without ever stopping. Nothing in the file explained how a night guard could navigate proprietary gene sequencing software like he designed it himself. Diane's hand hovered over the phone. One call to the head of security. One call to Gerald Harmon, the chief science officer, and this would be handled by morning. Nathan Briggs would be escorted out, probably arrested, and she could get back to worrying about Callistra. But her hand didn't move. 9 years ago, Diane had been a division VP at a company called Genosis Labs. She'd identified a critical flaw in a clinical trial protocol, a flaw that could have harmed patients and destroyed the company's credibility. She reported it internally, through all the right channels, following every procedure to the letter. 3 weeks later, she was placed on administrative leave, pending an investigation into alleged financial irregularities in her department. Irregularities that had been manufactured by the very people whose protocol she'd questioned. The investigation dragged on for 5 months. 5 months of watching her name appear in whispered conversations that stopped when she walked into a room. 5 months of recruiters who'd been eager to talk suddenly not returning her calls. She was cleared eventually. The real wrongdoers were quietly removed. But Diane never forgot what those 5 months taught her. The system punishes first and asks questions later, and sometimes it never gets around to the questions at all. She pulled her hand away from the phone. She looked at the frozen frame on her monitor. Nathan Briggs, caught red-handed, a black security guard in a restricted area he had no business being in. Every instinct she'd honed over 2 decades told her exactly what this was. But instincts could be wrong. Hers had been wrong about the people at Genosis who smiled at her while building a case to destroy her. She needed to understand what Nathan Briggs was actually doing before she ended his life with a phone call. The next morning was chaos, which had become the default setting at Meridian. The main conference room on the 8th floor felt like a pressure cooker as the research team walked through their Callistra progress report, or more accurately, their lack of progress. Dr. Durst, Amy Lynn, the lead biomedical researcher, was explaining for the third week running why the gene delivery mechanism wasn't stabilizing the way the models predicted. The core platform architecture has legacy elements that we're still trying to reverse engineer, Amy said, her voice strained. The original framework was built on a logic we can't fully reconstruct. We're confident we can. You've been confident since March. Diane interrupted, not unkindly. The FDA window closes in 72 hours. Amy's jaw tightened. She had nothing else to offer. The door swung open, and Gerald Harmon entered. At 57, Meridian's chief science officer moved through the world like a man who had never once questioned whether he belonged in any room he walked into. He wore authority the way other people wore cologne, just enough to be noticed. He'd been with Meridian since before Diane was hired, and he'd championed her promotion to CEO 2 years ago. He mentioned this whenever he wanted leverage. "I hear we're having growing pains," Gerald said, settling into the chair beside Diane with a practiced ease. "Nothing Amy's team can't sort out, I'm sure." "We're working on it," Diane said, her eyes still on Amy. Gerald smiled. That smile. Warm, paternal, and somehow condescending all at once. "Well, if we need to have a conversation about alternatives, I'm here." The meeting ground on for another hour, but Diane's mind kept circling back to the security footage. To Nathan Briggs, his hands moving through software that should have been incomprehensible to him. After the room emptied, Gerald lingered. "You look distracted," he said. Diane chose her words carefully. Something came up on the overnight security feed. One of the guards accessed sub-level 2 after hours. Something moved behind Gerald's eyes. A flicker, quick enough to miss if you weren't watching for it. Which guard? Nathan Briggs. The flicker again. I'd flag it with security. Get him out of the building before this becomes a liability. I'd rather look into it myself first. Gerald's smile thinned. Diane, we are 3 days from the most important submission in this company's history. You don't have time to investigate a security guard who's probably downloading files to sell on the dark web. Probably, Diane repeated. You know how it goes with these people. Gerald straightened his tie. They see an opening. They take it. It's not complicated. Call security. Let them do their job. These people. Diane let the phrase sit between them like something with a smell. She thought about the footage. The way Nathan moved through the modeling interface, that wasn't someone fumbling through stolen credentials. That was fluency. That was someone who understood what they were looking at. I'll handle it my way, she said. Gerald stood. Your call. Just remember, when this goes sideways, it's your name on the filing, not the security guards. He left. Diane sat alone in the conference room, letting his words settle. These people. She'd heard that phrase before, dressed up in different clothes, spoken by different mouths. It was always doing the same work. That night, Diane waited in her car at the far edge of the Meridian parking lot, headlights off, engine running. At 11:38 p.m., Nathan Briggs walked out the service entrance with his backpack over one shoulder and a weariness in his step that seemed to go deeper than a long shift. He moved differently out here, less invisible. He looked up at the sky for a moment, just a breath, and then walked to the bus stop on the corner. Following a city bus at midnight turned out to be straightforward. The streets were dead, and the bus stopped every few blocks, giving Diane plenty of room. She felt absurd. A CEO in a $60,000 car trailing a security guard through the city like a character in a bad detective novel. But she'd committed, and Diane Prescott did not abandon a commitment once made. The neighborhoods changed. Glass towers gave way to strip malls. Strip malls gave way to check-cashing stores and bodegas with steel grates over the windows. Diane had lived in this city for 12 years and never been to this part of it. Nathan got off in front of a Baptist church with a cracked foundation. He walked 2 blocks down a narrow street lined with shotgun houses until he reached a squat cinder block building with a hand-painted sign above the door, New Bridge Learning Center. The paint was sun-bleached and peeling, but the windows were taped with children's artwork, colorful drawings of DNA strands and molecules and stick-figure scientists. A banner read, Free Science and Coding Classes, every Tues and Thurs, All ages welcome. Diane sat in her car watching Nathan disappear inside. Science classes. The security guard who could navigate restricted gene modeling software was teaching science to children in a building that looked like it might not survive a strong storm. She should have left. She'd seen enough to know this wasn't corporate espionage. But the question had shifted. It wasn't whether Nathan had the skills. He clearly did. The question was why a man with those skills was walking hallways for $11 an hour. Before she could stop herself, Diane was out of the car and crossing the street. The inside of New Bridge Learning Center smelled like old carpet and hand sanitizer. Motivational posters lined the walls alongside more children's artwork. The fluorescent lights hummed with the frequency of fixtures that hadn't been replaced in a decade. An older woman at the front desk barely glanced up from her phone. "Science class is down the hall. Mr. Nathan just started. You can sit in the back." Diane thanked her and walked past a supply closet and a bathroom with a handwritten, temporarily out of service sign until she reached a room at the end of the corridor. She stopped in the doorway. Nathan Briggs stood at the front of the room in front of a whiteboard covered in diagrams. About 12 children, maybe ages 8 to 13, mostly black and brown, sat at folding tables cluttered with cheap microscopes and printed worksheets. Nathan was explaining how genetic mutations work, using a metaphor about a recipe book where someone had changed one word and how that one word could change the entire dish. His voice was warm, patient, alive in a way Diane had never heard from the man who said, "Good evening, ma'am," to her, without making eye contact in the Meridian lobby. He crouched beside a boy who was struggling with a worksheet, guiding his hand across the page. "Remember what we said. DNA is just instructions. If the instructions have a typo, the cell builds the wrong thing. Our job is to find the typo." A girl near the front raised her hand. "But Mr. Nathan, what if the typo makes something better? Like, what if the mistake is actually good?" Nathan considered the question with the seriousness of a man addressing a peer, not a child. That's one of the most important questions in all of science. Sometimes a mutation is harmful. Sometimes it's neutral. And sometimes, yeah, it's the thing that changes everything. Evolution is basically nature making typos and keeping the ones that work. He smiled. Life's a lot like that too, if you think about it. Diane watched him move through the room, calling each child by name, knowing their projects, adjusting his explanations to each kid's level. When a girl finally got her microscope focused and gasped at what she saw on the slide, Nathan's face broke into a grin so unguarded that Diane had to look away. This was not a thief. This was a teacher. She almost didn't notice the child who slipped in through a side door. A girl, maybe 10, with box braids and a backpack covered in science pins and stickers. She moved to an empty seat in the corner with the quiet precision of someone who didn't want to interrupt. But as she passed Nathan, she reached out and briefly squeezed his hand. "Hey, baby girl," Nathan murmured without breaking stride. "Homework's done," the girl whispered. "All of it, even the bonus. That's my Zoe." Zoe. His daughter. Diane had seen a dependent listed in his personnel file, but hadn't thought twice about it, watching Nathan steal glances at his daughter settling into her seat, watching the way his whole body softened when she was near. Diane understood something she'd missed before. This wasn't just a man running a free science program. This was a father building a world where his child could believe in possibility. Diane left before the class ended. She sat in her car for a long time, staring at the peeling sign above the door, then pulled out her phone and started digging. Meridian's archive records were technically restricted to senior executives, but nobody ever used them. The company had existed for 30 years, and most of its institutional memory lived in the heads of people who still worked there. But Diane needed to go back further than memory. She needed 7 years. She searched until almost 4 in the morning, sitting in her home office, surrounded by the tasteful, modern furniture she'd chosen to signal success. At 3:51 a.m., she found it. Not the thin file of Nathan Briggs, security guard. An older file, buried in an archive directory labeled Terminated Personnel. Year 23. Nathan James Briggs, Ph.D. Senior Research Scientist, Biomedical Engineering. Employee ID 3847. Diane stared at the photograph. The same face, but nothing else matched. The Nathan in this photo wore a pressed Oxford and a confident expression. His posture was open, his gaze direct. He looked like someone who belonged in a corner lab with his name on the door. According to the file, Nathan had been recruited 8 years ago as a mid-level researcher. Within 2 years, he'd risen to senior scientist, one of the most critical positions in Meridian's pipeline division. His reviews were incandescent. Visionary researcher, essential to platform development, architect of core gene delivery framework. Core gene delivery framework. Diane's hands went cold. She pulled up technical documentation from that era. The foundational platform that Callistra was built on, the platform Amy Lynn's team couldn't fully understand, had been designed by a small research team. The lead scientist on that team, the person who had conceived and built the gene delivery mechanism from scratch, was Nathan Briggs. Amy's words from the meeting played back in her head. The original framework was built on a logic we can't fully reconstruct. Because the person who built it was gone, the termination record was clinical. Terminated for cause, falsification of research data, and unauthorized removal of proprietary materials. The kind of language that ends a scientific career permanently. The kind of accusation that follows you into every database, every background check, every job application for the rest of your life. Except Diane had learned 9 years ago that termination records could lie. She kept searching. The email was in a folder marked for deletion that had never been purged. A ghost in the system, preserved by the kind of bureaucratic laziness that Diane usually cursed but was now grateful for. Dated 6 years and 4 months ago. Sender, Nathan Briggs. Recipient, Gerald Harmon. Diane read it 3 times, each pass making her feel sicker than the last. It was a formal internal complaint. Nathan had discovered that a group of Meridian executives, Gerald Harmon chief among them, had been suppressing adverse event data from an early-stage clinical trial, not minor discrepancies. Serious adverse reactions in 12 patients that were never reported to the FDA, reactions that should have halted the trial immediately. Instead, the data had been altered, the patients' records reclassified, and the trial continued as if nothing had happened. Nathan had documented everything. Original datasets, altered versions, internal emails discussing the cover-up, a trail so damning it could have resulted in criminal charges and the revocation of Meridian's research licenses. He'd sent it to Gerald because Gerald was the chief science officer, the person whose job it was to ensure scientific integrity. He'd trusted the system to work. 3 weeks later, Nathan Briggs was terminated for falsifying research data. The very crime he tried to report was turned into the weapon used to destroy him. Diane sat back, the pieces clicking together with nauseating precision. Gerald Harmon, who called her Diane in that warm fatherly voice. Gerald Harmon, who had smiled across the conference table and said, "These people," about a man whose life he had personally demolished. She thought about the community center. The faded Meridian logo she'd noticed in the corner of one of Nathan's teaching slides, old materials from when he was still a scientist. The weariness in his voice when he'd told those children that life was about nature, keeping the mistakes that work. 7 years ago, Nathan Briggs had been a brilliant researcher with a future most people only dream about. He'd done the right thing. He'd reported a cover-up that was putting patients at risk, and the system had eaten him alive. The next morning, Diane arrived at Meridian to find the building in controlled panic. Researchers were moving between conference rooms at a near run. Amy Lynn stood in the center of the main lab floor, her face gray, staring at a screen full of data that clearly terrified her. "What happened?" Diane said. Amy looked at her the way someone looks at a doctor right before receiving a diagnosis they already know. "The delivery mechanism. There's a critical instability in the core platform. If we submit to the FDA with this flaw, the therapy could trigger immune cascades in a subset of patients. We're not talking about mild reactions. We're talking about potentially fatal outcomes." The floor shifted under Diane's feet. "How long to fix it?" Amy shook her head. "The problem is buried in the foundational architecture. The original modeling, the logic behind the delivery sequence, none of us fully understand how it was built. We've been layering our work on top of it for years without ever really grasping the base layer. She paused. We'd need the person who designed it to even know where to start looking. Diane looked across the lab and saw Gerald Harmon by the windows, phone to his ear, speaking in low tones. His silver hair was, for the first time since she'd known him, slightly out of place. He hung up and walked toward her. We need to discuss our options. I've spoken with the board. They'll support a delay. These things happen. We restructure the team, try again in 6 months. A delay kills our FDA window. We've been promising this submission for a year. Better a delay than dead patients. Gerald's voice was silk over steel. We can attribute it to the research team's methodology. Bring in consultants. Start fresh. Attribute it to the research team. Let Amy Lynn and her scientists absorb the blame for a problem rooted in decisions made years before they were hired. Protect the actual source of the dysfunction, the fact that the company had driven out the one person who understood the platform and buried the reason why. It was exactly what Gerald had done to Nathan, and now he wanted to do it again. I need 24 hours, Diane said. Gerald frowned. For what? To find another way. Diane. That patient, condescending tone. There is no other way. The only person who could fix this is someone who understands the original platform architecture, and that person is. He stopped, catching himself. That person is who? Diane pressed. Gerald's face flickered. Then the mask returned. No one. That person is no one. That night, Diane drove back to New Bridge Learning Center. The classes had ended hours ago. The building was dark except for a single light in a back window. She parked across the street and sat for a long time, gathering herself. She was about to ask a man whose life her company had destroyed for help. A man who had every reason to despise everything Meridian represented. She had no right. She went anyway. Nathan sat at a metal desk in the back room, grading worksheets under a desk lamp. He looked up when Diane appeared in the doorway. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Then Nathan leaned back and folded his arms. Wondered how long it'd take. Diane blinked. You knew. Leedy, you drive a car that costs more than anybody in this zip code makes in 2 years. You think nobody noticed you parked out front last night? He shook his head slowly. And I saw someone pulling my old personnel file at 4 in the morning. Wasn't hard to figure out who. Diane felt the ground shift. She thought she was the one investigating. It hadn't occurred to her that Nathan might be investigating right back. Can I sit down? He gestured to a plastic folding chair clearly designed for a child. Diane sat. I know who you are, she said. I know what you are, she said. I know what you were, and I know what they did to you. Nathan's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes moved. Then you know more than most. What do you want? Callistra is failing. There's a critical flaw in the delivery platform, the platform you designed. My entire research team has been trying to fix it, but they don't understand the architecture. We submit to the FDA in 48 hours, and if we can't solve this, the company loses everything, and patients who need this therapy don't get it. And you want me to fix it? Yes. Nathan laughed. It was a sound with no joy in it. You want me to save the company that destroyed my career. The company that blacklisted me so thoroughly I couldn't get hired as a lab tech. You want me to rescue them. I want you to help me. It's not the same thing. It's exactly the same thing. No. Diane leaned forward. I found the email, Nathan. I know you reported a cover-up that was endangering patients. I know Gerald Harmon buried you for it instead of acting on it. And I know that right now, Gerald is trying to delay the submission so he can blame the research team and walk away clean, the same way he walked away clean after what he did to you. Nathan's jaw tightened. If Callistra fails, Diane continued, Gerald wins. He restructures, pushes out anyone he can't control, and keeps protecting the same rotten foundation that hid adverse event data 7 years ago. But if Callistra succeeds, if we fix this and prove the platform works, I have leverage. I can push for a real investigation. I can expose what happened. And the patients who are waiting for this therapy actually get it. And what about me? Nathan's voice was barely audible. What do I get? Another chance to be ground up by a system that was built to crush people who look like me? Diane didn't have an easy answer. She couldn't undo 7 years. She couldn't give him back his research career or the marriage that collapsed under the weight of it, or the nights his daughter spent confused and afraid. I can't change what happened, she said, but I can make sure it doesn't stay buried. And I can make sure that when this story comes out, you're not remembered as the scientist who falsified data. You're remembered as the man who tried to protect patients when nobody else would. Nathan stared at her. Behind him, the desk lamp buzzed softly. You want to know the hardest part? He said finally. It wasn't losing my position. It wasn't losing my wife, though that came close. The hardest part was my daughter. His voice caught. He looked away. She was 4 when I got fired. 4 years old. She didn't understand what a whistleblower was. She didn't know what retaliation meant. All she knew was that one day her daddy wore a white coat and worked in a big building. And the next day, he was picking up night shifts at a warehouse and they were sleeping in a shelter on Garrison Street. He paused. 3 months in that shelter. 3 months of Zoe asking me when we were going home. 3 months of me telling her everything was going to be fine, while I had absolutely no idea if that was true. Diane felt something fracture in her chest. She thought about her own life, the corner office, the car, the apartment with a view of the river. She'd earned those things, but she never had to earn them like this. She'd never had to look a child in the eye and lie about whether the world was safe. I'm sorry, she said. I don't need your sorry. Nathan turned back to face her. I need to know what happens after. Are you going to go back to your corner office and forget all of this? Or are you actually going to change something? Diane thought about it. Really thought. I don't know, she admitted. I want to say yes. I want to promise I'll tear the whole thing down and rebuild it. But I'm not going to lie to you. I don't know what I can actually accomplish. I only know what I'm willing to try. Nathan studied her for a long time. Then, slowly, he nodded. That's the first honest thing anyone from that company has ever said to me. The office door creaked open. A small figure stood in the doorway in pajamas, rubbing her eyes. Zoe Briggs looked at Diane with the guarded caution of a child who had learned early that strangers showing up late at night usually meant trouble. Daddy, who is that? Nathan's entire posture transformed. The bitterness and exhaustion fell away, replaced by something fierce and tender. Nobody, baby girl, just someone from work. Go back to sleep. Zoe didn't move. Her eyes stayed on Diane. Is she going to make things bad again? The question landed like a blow. This 10-year-old had already learned to brace for impact. She'd already learned that people in expensive clothes showing up at her father's door usually brought pain. No, Diane said, speaking directly to Zoe, I'm trying to fix something that should have been fixed a long time ago. Zoe looked at her father. Something passed between them, a private language Diane couldn't read. Nathan squeezed his daughter's hand. Go to bed, Zoo. We'll talk tomorrow. Zoe hesitated, then padded back down the hallway. Diane heard a mattress creak. When Nathan spoke again, his voice was almost a whisper. If I do this, you need to understand something. I'm not doing it for Meridian. I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it because my daughter needs to see that telling the truth doesn't always end in ruin. She needs to believe the world can work the way it's supposed to, even if I'm not sure I believe that anymore. 48 hours, Diane said. Can you stabilize the platform in 48 hours? Nathan looked at her, and for a moment, the ghost of the man in the old personnel photo surfaced. I built that platform from nothing in 14 months. I can fix one flaw in 48 hours, but I'm going to need full access to the research servers, real access. And I need Gerald Harmon to not know I'm there until it's too late. Leave Gerald to me. The 8th floor conference room had never felt smaller. Diane stood at the head of the table, watching the senior leadership team file in. Amy Lynn looked hollowed out. Legal sat clustered near the door. Marketing was already drafting a delay announcement on her laptop, and Gerald Harmon sat at Diane's right hand, silver-haired and composed. He had no idea. "Thank you for coming," Diane began. "As you know, we've identified a critical flaw in Callistra's delivery platform. Our research team has been working around the clock, but the problem exceeds their current expertise." Gerald nodded sympathetically, "which is why I've been in discussions with the board about a delay. Sometimes leadership means knowing when to—" "I've found another solution," Diane said. The room went still. "I've identified someone who can fix the instability. Someone who understands the original platform because he built it." Gerald's face changed. Just for a second. The mask cracked, and something panicked surfaced beneath it. "That's not possible," he said carefully. "The original researcher is no longer with the company." "I know." Diane walked to the conference room door and opened it. "That's why I brought him back." Nathan Briggs stepped into the room. He wasn't wearing his guard uniform. He'd found a suit. Not expensive, not new, but clean and pressed. He stood taller than Diane had ever seen him, shoulders squared, eyes forward. He looked like the photograph in the old file, the man who had once believed the system would protect him. Gerald's face went white. His hands, resting on the table, curled into fists. "This is completely inappropriate," Gerald said, his voice tight. "This man was terminated for cause. He has no business in this building." "Terminated for cause," Diane repeated. "That's what the file says, but files can be incomplete. Sometimes they're deliberately falsified." She placed a folder on the table. 6 years and 4 months ago, Nathan Briggs sent an internal complaint to the chief science officer of this company, documenting evidence that senior executives had suppressed adverse event data from a clinical trial. 12 patients experienced serious reactions that were never reported to the FDA. The room went airless. 3 weeks after filing that complaint, Nathan was terminated. The official reason was data falsification. But there was no falsification. There was only a scientist trying to protect patients and a company that chose to destroy him rather than face the truth. She slid a printed copy of the email across the table toward Gerald. "The complaint was sent to you, Gerald. You received it. You read it. And instead of investigating, you orchestrated the termination of the man who wrote it." Gerald stared at the paper. "This is absurd. These are baseless allegations from a disgruntled, I have the original data sets." Nathan spoke for the first time. Every head turned. "When I found the suppressed adverse events, I didn't just write an email. I copied everything. The original patient data, the altered versions, the internal communications discussing the changes. I've had those records for 7 years. Gerald's face had gone from white to gray. "I wasn't holding them for the right moment," Nathan continued, his voice level. "I was trying to survive, trying to keep a roof over my daughter's head, trying to find work when every institution in this industry had my name on a blacklist." He looked at Diane. "She came to me. She decided the truth mattered." Diane laid it out. Nathan would fix the platform. Gerald would leave the building immediately and wait for a call from legal. If the investigation confirmed what she believed it would, he would resign quietly and permanently. Gerald stood so fast his chair shrieked against the floor. "You can't do this. I've been with this company since before you were hired. I supported your promotion. You supported my promotion because you thought you could control me," Diane said. "Because you thought I'd be so grateful I'd never look in the closets." She held his gaze. "You were wrong." Gerald stood there trembling, scanning the room for a single sympathetic face. There were none. Finally, without a word, he walked out. The door closed behind him with a click that somehow sounded like a verdict. Nathan worked alone for 48 hours in a secured research suite. Diane had food brought in and checked on him twice a day, but didn't linger. He didn't want an audience. He wanted to work. On the morning of the submission deadline, Diane arrived at 5 a.m. to find Nathan waiting in the lobby. He was exhausted. His suit was wrinkled. His eyes were bloodshot, but something like a smile crossed his face. "It's done," he said. "The delivery mechanism is stable. Callistra is ready for submission." He handed her a flash drive, full documentation, every change I made, explained in detail so your team can maintain it going forward. Diane turned the drive over in her hands. "I don't know how to thank you. Keep your promises." "That's how. There's a board meeting this afternoon. I'm going to recommend full reinstatement. Your title, your salary, benefits, back pay, everything. You can come back." Nathan was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned to face her. "You think that's what I want?" Diane hesitated. "You think I spent 7 years dreaming about getting my old lab back? Walking through those doors and pretending none of it happened?" He shook his head. "That job doesn't exist anymore. The man who wanted it doesn't exist either. I figured out who I am while sleeping in a shelter with my daughter, while mopping floors and checking IDs, while people who couldn't read a gel electrophoresis walked past me like I was furniture." His voice softened. "I'm not going back, not because it was beneath me, because I built something that matters more." "New bridge," Diane said quietly. Nathan nodded. "Those kids are me, 30 years ago. They're brilliant, they're hungry, and nobody's giving them a shot. The system wasn't designed for them. It never was." His eyes met Diane's. "But I can change that. I can give them what nobody gave me. What do you need?" He smiled, a real one, the first she'd ever seen from him. "Ask me after your submission." Callistra was submitted to the FDA at noon. By the end of the day, the platform was performing beyond projections. The instability was gone. The therapy that could change the lives of thousands of patients was on track. When the dust settled, Diane gathered the entire company. Standing on the small stage in the main atrium, looking out at hundreds of faces, she told them the truth. She told them about Nathan Briggs, about what he'd built and what had been done to him and why. She told them about Gerald Harmon and the investigation already underway, and then she told them the harder thing. "I need to be honest about my own part in this," she said. "Nathan Briggs worked in this building for 14 months. 14 months of walking our halls, checking our doors, saying good evening to every one of us. And in all that time, I never once looked at him. Never once wondered who he was or what his story might be. I saw a security guard and I assumed that was all there was to see." The room was silent. When I finally did look, it was because I suspected him of a crime. Because my first instinct, when I saw a black man in a place he wasn't supposed to be, was to assume the worst. She let it land. "I'd like to tell you I don't carry those assumptions, but I do. We all do. And until we're willing to confront that honestly, we're going to keep destroying good people because they don't match what we expect." The investigation into Gerald Harmon concluded 4 weeks later. The suppressed adverse event data was confirmed. 3 additional executives were implicated. Gerald resigned for personal reasons. Within a month, he had relocated to another state. His reputation in the industry demolished by whispers that traveled faster than any press release. Meridian issued a formal statement acknowledging the wrongful termination of Nathan Briggs, the fabricated charges, and the systematic retaliation he had endured. It wasn't enough. It could never be enough. But Diane also kept her other promises. She established mandatory independent review of all terminations. She created a whistleblower protection fund with legal resources and financial support. She hired a chief ethics officer with real authority and zero interference from senior leadership. And she approved a $3 million grant to the New Bridge Learning Center. On the day the check was presented, Diane drove to the south side one more time. The building looked different now. Fresh paint on the sign, new computers visible through the windows, a line of children waiting outside for the evening class to begin. She found Nathan in the back room, arranging lab equipment that still had the shipping labels on it. Zoe sat at a desk nearby, working on what looked like a science fair project, a model of a DNA helix built from pipe cleaners and beads that was surprisingly accurate. Nathan looked up when Diane appeared. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Zoe glanced at her father, then at Diane, and then back at her project. "You're the lady from before," she said matter-of-factly. "I am. Daddy says you kept your promise. I tried." Zoe considered this with the gravity of a 10-year-old who had already learned that trying was worth something, even when the world made it hard. Then she looked at her father with an expression that held more pride than most adults ever learned to carry. "See, Daddy," she said, "you always told me the truth wins." And it did. Nathan Briggs looked at his daughter, and for the first time in 7 years, he didn't have to pretend that he believed it. Sometimes the system breaks the people who try to fix it. Sometimes it takes years for the fracture to mend, but every now and then, someone decides to look past what they expect to see, and what they find changes everything, not just for one man, but for every child sitting in a cinder block classroom, learning for the first time that the world might have room for them after all.